Have you ever seen something so clear, so undeniable, and still found yourself questioning it later? Because that's exactly what happened to Israel. And if you really understand why, you might start to see something uncomfortable and deeply personal. This isn't just a story about ancient people in the desert. This is a story about human nature, and maybe about you. If you want more Bible stories explained simply and truthfully, subscribe and stay with me, because what you're about to hear might change how you see your own faith. It began with miracles that no one could deny. Israel wasn't guessing if God was real. They saw him move. They were slaves in Egypt, broken, exhausted, treated like nothing. Generations had lived and died in chains. Hope wasn't just gone, it had been forgotten. And then everything changed. Through Moses, God sent the plagues. The Nile turned to blood. Frogs filled the land. Darkness covered Egypt so thick it could be felt. And finally, the moment that shattered Egypt's power, the death of the firstborn. Israel didn't hear about these things from a distance. They lived through them. They saw Egypt fall apart while they were protected. And then came the moment no one in Israel would ever forget. They stood at the edge of the Red Sea. Behind them, Pharaoh's army. In front of them, water. No escape, no plan, no human solution. And then God made a way. The sea split, not metaphorically, not symbolically, physically. Walls of water stood on both sides as they walked through on dry ground. Imagine that. The sound of the wind, the smell of the sea, the sight of water rising like walls around you. Every step was a miracle. And when they reached the other side, the waters crashed back down on the Egyptian army. Their enemies gone, just like that. If you had been there, would you ever doubt again? Most people would say no. But the story doesn't go the way you expect. Because just days later, they started complaining. They had no water. They were thirsty. And instead of remembering what they had just seen, they panicked. Why did you bring us out here to die? They asked Moses. Think about that. The same people who walked through a split sea now believed they were abandoned. God provided water, and then food, manna from heaven, appearing every morning, bread from the sky. Every day, they could step outside and gather what they needed. No farming, no working for it, just trust. And yet, they still doubted. When Moses went up Mount Sinai to receive God's law, something strange happened. The people grew impatient. They couldn't see Moses anymore. They couldn't see God. And suddenly, everything they had witnessed started to feel distant, unreal. So they did something shocking. They made a golden calf, an idol, and they said, "This is the God who brought us out of Egypt." Let that sink in. They replaced the God who split the sea with something they could see and touch. Why? Why would people who witnessed undeniable miracles turn away so quickly? That's where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because the answer isn't about intelligence. It's not about evidence. It's about the human heart. Miracles can show you that God is real, but they don't force you to trust him, because trust isn't built on moments. It's built on relationship. And Israel struggled with that. They had seen God's power, but they didn't yet know his character. So every time something went wrong, fear took over. And fear has a way of erasing memory. It makes you forget what you've already seen. It makes the past feel smaller, and the present feel overwhelming. So instead of remembering the Red Sea, they focused on their thirst. Instead of remembering manna, they worried about tomorrow's hunger. Instead of trusting God's plan, they longed for Egypt. Yes, Egypt, the place of their slavery. At one point, they literally said it would have been better to go back, better to be slaves. That's how powerful fear can be. It doesn't just make you doubt God. It can make you romanticize what once broke you. And this pattern continued. Over and over again, God would provide. They would trust for a moment. Then something would happen, and they would doubt again. It reached a critical moment when they finally stood at the edge of the promised land. This was it, the land God had promised them. 12 spies were sent to explore it, and when they came back, their report split the nation. The land was good, but the people living there were strong, powerful, dangerous. 10 of the spies focused on fear. "We can't do this," they said. They're too strong. Only two, Joshua and Caleb, said the opposite. God is with us. We can take the land. But the people listened to fear. Again, they forgot everything God had already done, and they refused to go in. That moment changed everything, because it revealed something deeper than doubt. It revealed a pattern, a cycle. See a miracle. Feel secure. Face a problem. Forget the miracle. Choose fear. And here's the part that matters most. This story wasn't preserved in the Bible just to describe Israel. It was preserved to reveal something about us. Because how many times have people today asked God for a sign, received an answer, and then weeks later, doubted again? How many times have you experienced something you couldn't explain, felt certain, and then slowly questioned it? Not because the evidence disappeared, but because the feeling did. That's the key. Feelings change. Circumstances change. And if your faith is built only on what you feel in the moment, it will rise and fall constantly. Israel's problem wasn't that God didn't show up. It's that they expected one moment to carry them forever. But faith doesn't work like that. It has to be renewed daily, just like the manna. You couldn't store manna for tomorrow. You had to trust again each day, and that's where many people struggle, because it's easier to believe when everything is going well. But real trust shows up when things don't make sense, when the water isn't there, when the future feels uncertain, when God feels silent. That's when Israel struggled the most. And that's when the story becomes personal. Because up until this point, it's easy to watch Israel from a distance. It's easy to shake your head and think, how could they not trust God after everything they saw? But the moment you bring the story closer, it stops being about them, and it starts revealing something about you. Because doubt doesn't usually show up in loud, obvious ways. It doesn't always look like rejecting God completely. Most of the time, it's quieter than that. It looks like hesitation, second-guessing, holding back, just in case things don't work out. It looks like saying you trust God while still trying to control every outcome. And if you're honest, that tension is something almost everyone has felt. Israel didn't wake up one morning and decide, we're going to stop believing. It happened slowly, step by step, moment by moment. One complaint here, one fear there, one decision to rely on themselves instead of God. And over time, those small moments added up until their trust wasn't as strong as it once seemed. And that's important, because it shows that doubt isn't always about what you believe. Sometimes it's about what you focus on. Think about what Israel focused on. When they were hungry, they focused on the lack of food. When they were thirsty, they focused on the absence of water. When they saw strong enemies, they focused on their own weakness. They weren't denying that God existed. They were just letting their problems feel bigger than His presence. And that shift changes everything, because what you focus on shapes how you see reality. If you focus on fear, everything starts to feel dangerous. If you focus on lack, everything starts to feel insufficient. If you focus only on what you can't control, you start to feel powerless. And Israel kept falling into that pattern, again and again and again. But there's something even deeper happening beneath the surface, something that isn't obvious at first. Israel had just come out of slavery. For generations, they had lived under control. Every decision was made for them. Every outcome was dictated by someone else. They didn't have to trust. They just had to survive. And suddenly, they were free. But freedom comes with something they weren't used to: responsibility, choice, trust. And that's where things got difficult. Because trusting God requires something that slavery never demanded: letting go. And letting go is uncomfortable. It means admitting that you don't have control. It means stepping forward without knowing exactly how things will work out. It means believing before you see the result. And Israel struggled with that, not because they were uniquely flawed, but because they were human. And that's where the story connects even more deeply. Because people today don't struggle with the same circumstances, but they struggle with the same patterns. You might not be walking through a desert, but you face moments where the future felt uncertain. Moments where you didn't know how things would work out. Moments where you had to choose between trusting or trying to control everything yourself. And in those moments, the same questions rise up. What if this doesn't work? What if I make the wrong decision? What if God doesn't come through this time? And just like Israel, those questions don't come from nowhere. They come from fear, from past experiences, from the desire to protect yourself. And that's what makes this story so real, because it doesn't present doubt as something only weak people experience. It shows that even people who witness miracles can still struggle. But the story doesn't stop at exposing the problem. It also points towards something deeper, something that changes how you understand faith entirely. Because if miracles alone weren't enough to sustain Israel's trust, then what was God actually trying to build in them? The answer isn't just belief. It's relationship. And relationship is different, because belief can exist without connection. You can believe something is true without actually trusting it, without relying on it, without letting it shape your decisions. But relationship changes how you respond. God wasn't just trying to prove his power to Israel. He was inviting them into something ongoing, something daily, something that would grow over time. And that's why their journey wasn't quick. It wasn't immediate. It took years, wandering in the wilderness, learning, failing, trying again. And through all of that, God remained present. That's another part of the story that's easy to miss. Even when Israel doubted, God didn't disappear. Even when they complained, he still provided. Even when they turned away, he didn't abandon them. That doesn't mean there were no consequences. There were. Decisions mattered. Choices had impact. But God's presence didn't depend on their perfection. And that's important, because if it did, no one would stand a chance. Instead, the story shows something unexpected. God's faithfulness didn't change, even when theirs did. And that creates a tension, because it forces you to ask a different question. Not just, why did Israel doubt? But, why did God remain? Why stay with people who kept questioning? Why continue guiding them? Why keep providing, even when they didn't fully trust? Because the story was never just about reaching a destination. It was about transformation. God wasn't just leading them to a place. He was shaping who they were becoming. And that takes time. It takes struggle. It takes moments where trust is tested. And that's where the story becomes even more personal. Because the same process still exists. Not in the same form. Not in the same setting. But in the same principle. Growth doesn't happen in moments of certainty. It happens in moments of tension, moments where you don't have all the answers, moments where you have to decide what you're going to trust. And that's why the wilderness mattered. It wasn't just a physical place. It was a place of testing, a place of learning, a place where what was inside them was revealed. And if you look at your own life, you can probably recognize similar moments. Times where things didn't go as planned. Times where you felt uncertain. Times where you had to choose between fear and trust. And maybe you didn't always choose perfectly. But here's the part of the story that often gets overlooked. Failure wasn't the end for Israel or for you, because the purpose of the journey wasn't to prove that they would never doubt. It was to show that even when they did, the story could continue. That growth was still possible. That change could still happen. And that shifts the entire perspective, because it means the focus isn't on never struggling. It's on what you do within the struggle. Do you let it pull you away, or do you let it push you deeper? Because that's the question everything eventually comes back to. Not whether you'll face uncertainty. Not whether doubt will show up. Not whether fear will try to take control. But what you do when it does. Because there's a version of the story where Israel's doubt is the end. A version where their fear disqualifies them. Where their repeated failures cause God to walk away. Where the wilderness becomes a place they never leave. But that's not the story we're given. And that matters. Because if it were, most people wouldn't have a story either. Instead, what you see is something far more complex. Israel doubted. Yes, they complained. Yes, they resisted. They questioned. They even turned away at times. And yet, the story keeps moving forward. That should catch your attention, because it means something deeper is happening beneath the surface. Something that isn't dependent on perfect performance. The journey continues. not because Israel earned it, but because God was doing something bigger than their moment-to-moment reactions. And that shifts everything, because now the story isn't just about human inconsistency. It's about divine persistence. God continues guiding them through the wilderness, a pillar of cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night, visible direction, constant presence, a reminder that even when they couldn't see the full path, they weren't alone. And yet, even with that, there were still moments of doubt. That tells you something important. Clarity doesn't eliminate struggle. Even when direction is visible, trust is still required, because knowing where to go is not the same as trusting the one leading you there. And this is where the story deepens even further, because over time, something begins to change. Not instantly, not dramatically, but gradually. A new generation begins to rise. The people who left Egypt, who were shaped by slavery, who constantly looked backward, who struggled to let go of what they once knew, they begin to fade from the story. And in their place, a new group emerges. People who didn't live under Pharaoh, people who grew up in the wilderness, people who learned to depend on God as their normal, and their perspective is different. They still face challenges. They still encounter uncertainty. But something has shifted in how they respond, because they didn't just hear about the Red Sea. They grew up hearing the story. They didn't just see manna as a miracle. It was part of their daily life. What once felt extraordinary became foundational. And that's important, because it shows how consistency shapes trust over time. Not just big, dramatic moments, but daily provision, daily guidance, daily reminders. And slowly, that builds something stronger, something deeper, something more stable. Not a faith that depends on constant signs, but a trust that continues, even when things aren't obvious. And eventually, they arrive again at the edge of the promised land. The same moment, the same opportunity, the same invitation. But this time, the response is different. Instead of shrinking back, they step forward. Not because the obstacles disappeared, not because the land suddenly became easy, not because fear was completely gone, but because trust had grown stronger than fear. And that's the turning point. Because the difference wasn't in the circumstances. It was in what had been formed within them. And that brings a story back to you. Because the same process still happens. Not in deserts and pillars of fire, but in everyday life. Moments where things don't go as expected. Moments where outcomes are unclear. Moments where you're faced with a decision. Step forward or step back. Trust or control. And just like Israel, those moments don't just test you. They shape you. Every response reinforces something. Every decision builds a pattern. Every choice moves you in a direction. And over time, those small moments become something bigger. They form who you are becoming. That's why this question matters so much. Do you let uncertainty pull you away? Or do you let it push you deeper? Because deeper doesn't mean having all the answers. It doesn't mean everything suddenly makes sense. It doesn't mean the fear disappears completely. It means choosing to move forward anyway. It means trusting, even when you don't fully understand. And that kind of trust doesn't happen all at once. It's built moment by moment, choice by choice. Just like Israel, they didn't transform overnight. It took time. It took failure. It took repetition. But eventually, something changed. And that means something for you. Because it means you're not defined by a single moment either. Not by one doubt. Not by one mistake. Not by one season of uncertainty. Your story is still moving, still unfolding, still being shaped. And what matters most is the direction you choose next. Because every moment of uncertainty carries two possibilities. You can let it close you off, make you more guarded, more controlled, more focused on avoiding risk. Or you can let it open something, a deeper level of trust, a greater willingness to step forward, a stronger connection to something beyond what you can see. And that choice repeats again and again and again, just like it did for Israel. But here's where the story reaches its deepest point. Because even after entering the promised land, the pattern didn't completely disappear. There were still moments of struggle, still moments of forgetting, still moments of turning away. And yet, the story continued, through leaders, through judges, through kings, through prophets, again and again, calling people back, reminding them, inviting them deeper, because the invitation never changed. Trust, not just in what God can do, but in who He is. And over time, that invitation points forward. Because everything in this story, every miracle, every failure, every moment of doubt and return, was never meant to end in the wilderness. It was always pointing somewhere beyond it, forward to a deeper understanding of who God is, forward to a relationship not built only on visible signs, forward to something that would finally address the problem Israel kept facing again and again. Because if you look honestly at their story, the issue was never lack of evidence. They saw enough, more than enough. The issue was something internal, something deeper than circumstances, something that couldn't be solved by another miracle. And that's where the story starts to shift. Because instead of just showing what happened, it begins to reveal why it kept happening. Israel didn't just struggle because life was hard. They struggled because their hearts were divided. Part of them wanted to trust God. Part of them still wanted control. Part of them remembered what He had done. Part of them feared what might happen next. And that tension created the cycle. Obedience followed by doubt. Trust followed by fear. Clarity followed by confusion. Over and over again. So the question becomes, if miracles weren't enough, what could actually change that pattern? And that's exactly what the later parts of the story begin to answer. Because as time goes on, something new starts to appear. Not just laws, not just instructions, but voices, prophets, men and women who didn't just remind Israel what God had done, but spoke about what God was going to do. And their message carried something different, something deeper. They didn't just say, try harder. They didn't just say, remember more. They pointed to something that hadn't happened yet, a change that wouldn't come from outside circumstances, but from within. One of the clearest moments of this comes through a promise that feels almost impossible when you first hear it, a promise that directly addresses the problem Israel kept facing, that their hearts would be changed, not just guided, not just corrected, changed, because the real issue wasn't that they didn't have enough rules. They had those. The real issue wasn't that they didn't know what to do. They knew. The issue was that knowing and doing were not the same, and that's something that hasn't changed. Even today, people can know what's right and still struggle to do it. They can believe something is true and still hesitate when it matters most, because information alone doesn't transform the heart. So the invitation that points forward isn't just about more understanding. It's about transformation. And that's where the story begins to move toward its deepest meaning. Because everything Israel experienced was preparing for something they couldn't fully see yet. All the moments of provision were pointing to a greater provision. All the moments of guidance were pointing to a clearer direction. All the moments of sacrifice were pointing to something final. And even their struggle with doubt was pointing to the need for something more lasting, something that wouldn't fade when circumstances changed, something that wouldn't disappear when fear showed up, something that wouldn't depend on constant reminders. Because if trust had to be rebuilt from scratch every time, the cycle would never end. And that's exactly what the prophets began to reveal, that God wasn't just working around their weakness. He was planning to address it directly, to do something that would reach deeper than behavior, deeper than habit, deeper than fear, to reach the heart itself. And this is where the story stops being only about Israel's past and starts becoming a message for the future. Because the invitation isn't limited to one group of people. It's not limited to one moment in history. It extends outward, forward, to anyone who recognizes the same pattern, the same struggle, the same tension between trust and control. Because at its core, this story is about something universal, the gap between what we know and how we live. And that gap can't be closed by effort alone. It requires something deeper. And that's why the invitation matters so much. Because it's not just saying, do better. It's saying, come deeper, deeper than surface level belief, deeper than temporary confidence, deeper than moment-based faith, into something that lasts. And that kind of depth doesn't remove challenges that, if anything, it changes how you face them. Because one of the biggest misunderstandings about faith is this idea that once you believe enough, life becomes smooth, predictable, easier. But Israel's story proves the opposite. Even after everything, even after growth, even after learning to trust more deeply, they still face battles. Real ones. When they entered the promised land, it wasn't empty. It wasn't waiting quietly for them to walk in and take it. There were fortified cities, armies, opposition. The promise didn't remove the resistance. And that's where many people struggle today, because they expect that trust will eliminate difficulty, that if they're on the right path, things should fall into place without friction. But that's not what the story shows. Instead, it shows something more honest, more real. Trust doesn't remove the challenge. It changes your position within it. You're no longer facing it alone. You're no longer relying only on your own understanding. You're no longer controlled entirely by fear. But the challenge itself, it still exists. And that's where depth begins to reveal itself. Because it's easy to talk about trust when everything is going well, when the outcome feels certain, when the path is clear. But depth is revealed when none of that is true, when the outcome is unclear, when the pressure is real, when the stakes feel high. That's when you see what's actually been built inside you. And Israel faced that moment again, as they stood before Jericho, a city unlike anything they had faced before. High walls, strong defenses, a structure designed to keep enemies out. From a human perspective, it was impossible. And yet, the instruction they were given made no sense. Walk around the city, once a day, for 6 days. Then on the 7th day, 7 times. Blow trumpets. Shout. That was it. No weapon strategy. No siege plan. No logical explanation. Just obedience. And this is where the difference becomes clear. The earlier generation would have questioned it, debated it, doubted it. This doesn't make sense. This won't work. We need a better plan. But this time, they moved forward, not because it made sense, but because trust had been built. And when they followed through, the walls fell, not gradually, not partially, completely. And that moment reveals something powerful, because it shows that depth isn't about understanding everything. It's about trusting enough to move forward, even when you don't. And that kind of trust changes how you approach everything. Because now, you're not waiting for perfect clarity before taking a step. You're not demanding full control before moving forward. You're not letting uncertainty stop you completely. You're moving with trust. And that doesn't mean you never question. It doesn't mean you never feel fear. But it means those things don't decide your direction. And that's a completely different way of living. Because most people are waiting. Waiting until things feel certain. Waiting until they feel ready. Waiting until the risk feels low enough. But that moment rarely comes. And if it does, it usually comes after the opportunity has already passed. Israel could have stood in front of Jericho, waiting for a better plan, a clearer strategy, a more logical explanation. But if they had, nothing would have happened, because some things only happen on the other side of trust. And that's a pattern that continues throughout the story. Moments where action comes before full understanding. Moments where obedience comes before visible results. Moments where the outcome only becomes clear after the step is taken. And that's where depth truly begins to change you, because you're no longer living based only on what you can see. You're living based on something deeper. And that doesn't make life easier, but it makes your foundation stronger. Because now, when challenges come, you're not starting from zero. You're building on everything that's been formed within you. And that's something Israel had to learn over time. Because even after victories, even after moments of clarity, there were still times they struggled, still times they forgot, still times they drifted. But the difference was that they now had a history, a pattern of seeing God move, a foundation of trust that had been built over time. And that foundation mattered, because it meant that even when they stumbled, they weren't starting over completely. They had something to return to, and that's something many people overlook. Growth isn't about never struggling again. It's about having something to stand on. When you do, a deeper perspective, a stronger trust, a clearer understanding of who God is, even when circumstances don't reflect it immediately. And that's what this entire story has been building toward. Not perfection, not constant certainty, but depth, a kind of trust that doesn't disappear when things get difficult, a kind of faith that doesn't depend on constant signs, a kind of relationship that continues, even when the path isn't clear. And that's where the invitation becomes even more real. Because at that point, it's no longer just a story you're listening to. It's a decision you're standing in. Right now, not in the wilderness, not at the Red Sea, not in front of Jericho, but in your own life, in your own uncertainty, in your own questions, in your own moments where things don't fully make sense. Because the truth is, everyone reaches a moment where belief becomes a choice, not based on what you've seen before, but based on what you choose to trust next. Israel had those moments again and again, and so do you. Moments where fear feels louder than faith. Moments where control feels safer than surrender. Moments where stepping back feels easier than stepping forward. And in those moments, the invitation is still the same. Not louder, not forced, but present. Will you trust me here too? Not just when things are clear. Not just when everything is working out. But here, in this exact place. Because that's where real depth is formed. Not in perfect conditions, but in real ones. And maybe that's why this story was preserved. Not just to show what happened back then, but to meet you where you are now. So the question isn't just about Israel anymore. It's about you. What will you do with the moment you're in? Will you let it pull you away? Or will you let it push you deeper? If this spoke to you, write in the comments, I choose trust, and subscribe for more Bible stories that don't just tell history, but help you live it.